Hello and welcome to the newest edition of Pro Pharma Talks. My name is Alex Hernandez. Alongside me as always is Dr. Craig Stern. And our topic for today is vaping. It's very much in the news right now. A lot of states are considering legislation on vaping. I believe Minnesota, right? Minnesota?
Michigan.
Oh, Michigan. Michigan recently put a temporary ban on vaping, and it leaves a lot of people wondering why. Because vaping was supposed to be the more healthy alternative to smoking, as far as I understand it.
Yeah.
It was vaping, you using water, and with some nicotine, and depending on your vape pen, of course, because there's some of those extracurriculars out there that like to get creative with their vape pens. But nonetheless, we're talking about vaping in general, and don't get any ideas. All right, so what is vaping for those that don't know exactly what it is?
Yeah, we picked this time. Actually, I picked the topic for everybody this time because it is so much in the news. And the question was, what's the difference between vaping and smoking of regular cigarettes? What's the issue that is creating such a concern? At least 2 people have died this year because of vaping. So the question is how does this work? And we'll kind of put it all together. Bottom line here is this. The vaping has been sold as a flavorful response to smoking, where effectively people don't smoke cigarettes, they can do vaping. It's much better for you. It's healthier for people.
You don't need matches.
You don't need matches and all that, and it's less toxins
Right.
that you get from the nicotine in the cigarette. The reality of this is that the use of this has gotten way ahead of where the science is. Just recently, the FDA was the one that came in and put some regulations on it. Before that, there were no regulations, so nobody knew what was in the little capsule
Right.
and the rest that was used for vaping. Nobody knew what the concentration was, etc. Bottom line here is this is kind of like a vaporizer. You have a medication in a liquid. You have a vaporizer that heats up that liquid, creates a steam, and you inhale the steam. Now, typically with a vaporizer, you're doing it because you have pneumonia or you have perhaps some lung problems, emphysema, COPD, whatever, that are using it, so you're getting medications in to try and deal with your lungs. In this particular case, you've got a chamber that has medication. You have a heater, and effectively the heater is working very quickly to vaporize that so that you're smoking that little capsule. Now, what's in it? What's in it is propylene glycol, also glycerol, some nicotine, and then flavor. Propylene glycol is a measure that's used in some thickening agent for laxation. You don't do it all the time, obviously.
Right.
Only when you have laxative problems or something in preparation for certain kind of surgeries. Glycerol is something that you don't normally ingest, although some variants of glycerol are in some particular medications in very, very small amounts. But all of this is packed into these little capsules that are being used in order to vape this information. So vaping is supposedly the alternative to smoking. Science has been way behind it. They haven't studied it. 1, because the FDA wasn't doing any regulations on it,
Right.
and 2, because it's relatively new. But at the end of the day, more and more of the science is coming out, and vaping is being related to myocardial infarcts or heart attacks. It's being related to epilepsy or seizures. It's being related to other lung conditions. And we'll talk about what that means and what the pharmacology is of that. But that in general is what this is about.
Right. So they've been able to sell it. They don't need FDA approval in order to sell it. But the FDA does need to take time in order to test it.
Yes.
So how do you get around selling something that you don't necessarily need FDA approval and say that it's completely healthy?
Well, you know, the marketplace is set up in a couple of ways. One is the prescription medications that are highly restricted, have a bunch of regulations, have to be tested with regard to expiration, effectiveness, and safety.
Right.
On the other side are over-the-counter things that when the FDA approves it, they're approving it only for safety. They're not approving it whether it works or not, they're approving it only for safety. So all those things that you get in the front of a pharmacy that are over the counter, those just need to be safe. Now, the good news is that many of those things were prescription at one time, and they've moved from prescription to over the counter. So you know that they work because at one time they were already tested to make sure that they were effective. Other things, on the other hand, are kind of remedies that have been around a long time, and in effect were never prescription, but they have been tested to make sure that they're effective. The third group of things is where no testing has occurred at all. The FDA had no regulations on it, there were no requirements on it. You could make it effectively in a bathtub for all that matters, but there would be different strengths of it depending on what was used, depending on what kind of nicotine was used and where the source of it was, how much propylene glycol, how much glycol were in the product. Nobody knew. It was wherever it came from. So there was a manufacturing problem and a problem that without regulation, nobody knew exactly what they were inhaling. Now there are some regulations, but this also is very new.
Right.
So in what we're talking about, we're not talking about something where people have had to put everything through before they could sell it. This is a very new oversight and regulation to handle the problem.
Right. So when the legislation starts to come up, when I know that certain cities around Los Angeles were thinking about banning vape pens and vaping, and I think Calabasas was one of them because they've already banned smoking in their city. But now they want to also ban vaping, and they don't necessarily know how to go about it because not everybody knows exactly what's in it. So, and that promotes another problem with society because you're selling things that you don't know what's in it, but you're able to sell it and also cast it off as a healthier alternative.
And I think that eventually is going to go away, hopefully sooner rather than later. Just to put this whole thing in perspective, there's about 10 million people in the United States who smoke from the CDC. And those numbers may be much smaller than what they actually are. There are about 500,000 or more people that die every year from smoking, from the impact of smoking with regard to its impact on lung cancer, etc.
Or the long-term effects of smoking.
Yeah, and this is not a simple thing. Now the question is, where does vaping fit into this? If you look at a cigarette, a total cigarette is somewhere in the range of 1 milligram to 1.5 milligrams of nicotine. The vaping, that little capsule, runs somewhere between 15 and 18 milligrams per ml of that vapor. So it's not just the whole thing, it's 15 to 18 milligrams for every ml of that capsule. You're looking at 10 times what it is in a cigarette to what you're getting in the vape. But for each ml of that vape. So from a pharmacology standpoint, you've got a much bigger concentration of nicotine plus all the other stuff that's in it. That's number one. Number two is that therefore the problems of nicotine are magnified because you're dealing with something that has a concentration for every ml that's 10 times what you're going to be getting in a cigarette. The cigarette is not necessarily good for you. Vaping with this kind of concentration at 10 times is also not any good for you, but it makes it even worse. That concentration leads to a lot of other problems, and that's where we need to talk next.
Was the argument against cigarettes mainly about nicotine, or was it about the other substances within it?
Well, the main argument is about nicotine.
Right.
However, there are other contaminants in it, And that was already a concern because you had to do some significant chemical testing to show all of the other contaminants that were in it. Bottom line, though, is nicotine is the one that was dealing with it. And purely from a pharmacology standpoint, I know everybody will go to sleep here, but let me at least make it really simple. What the issue here is the following. You're inhaling this nicotine, propylene glycol. You've got a flavor to it, so there's something that's attractive from a flavor standpoint. What this does is to dehydrate the lungs. Right now, the lungs are hydrated. They have water in them. It allows them to be flexible. It allows them to be able to contract and deal with air coming in, air going out, and deal with that. Anything that interferes with that becomes a problem. Well, at these concentrations and what we're giving, what it does is it dehydrates. It takes the water away. That means that whatever is in the vapor doesn't easily move from the lungs to the blood or from the blood to the lungs because you've effectively begun to stop that movement.
Right.
That movement becomes a problem because then things tend to collect in the lungs. And when you have collection of these things, they stop oxidation that would normally be happening with air going back and forth. And as a result of that, we begin to see lung problems, we begin to see cancer, we begin to see myocardial infarcts because there's no transfer of air.
Right.
So the oxygen itself is not oxygenated, creating that problem. And then without air, also epilepsy or seizures, things like that. So there is a reason for it, and without getting overly complicated from the pharmacology standpoint, there's very real concerns about high concentration of nicotine, dehydration of what's going on in the lungs, and then, to be fair, there's a whole bunch of the science that hasn't caught up with this at all. So there's a whole bunch of whatever's happening is not doing it. The New England Journal of Medicine just published a new issue this week that has a whole listing of studies that are being done on vaping and identifying the risks and the problems of it. So the science is trying to catch up to where everybody is, but every time they look at it, the story is not a good one.
So we're just getting started as far as understanding the problems with vaping.
We are.
So is this actually the same as smoking a cigarette? Is vaping the same thing?
Well, the idea is that you would effectively not have to smoke because you could get the benefits of vaping.
Right.
The reality of it is smoking, and it's smoking at a much higher concentration than what you would do with that. And the argument in smoking has always been, well,
the addictive
educate.
properties.
It's addictive for sure. It's there's websites for kids and the rest that are all identifying it as poison. So all you're doing is inhaling poison,
Right.
Which is true. But the other part of it that happens with smoking is how do you get people to stop? Well, when you're dealing with getting people to stop, you educate them, you put them on programs, you give them some drugs, Nicorette, things like that, to chew or otherwise in order to try and stop
To help curb the addictive.
to curb it.
Yeah.
But the biggest problem is something called recidivism, which effectively means that you stop but you go back.
Right.
So and recidivism has always been high for people who stop smoking. It's somewhere in the range of 65% or more. So
You
people
say
stop
go back to.
smoking.
Oh.
So you stop smoking, and then over a short period of time, you go back to smoking. That's the recidivism. And in general, there's been multiple studies that have given multiple different numbers, but the numbers probably are in excess of 60% of people that go back. So you don't solve the problem, you stop it, but then people go back to deal with it and address it. And so education and all of those things are becoming just as important in vaping as they are in smoking regular cigarettes,
Right.
because all of the same problems occur. If you're inhaling a poison, it's an addictive poison. Then the question is, well, this was supposed to stop you from dealing with regular smoking, but now what are you going to do when they're addicted to the vaping, and how are you going to get them off of that? And there's already been a lot of history about what to do. Not terribly effective, but still a history of it.
Right.
Education, some Nicorette chewing gum,
Advertisements.
all kinds of stuff.
Right.
Especially in people, who it's always focused on people who are older, who had a high risk of heart attacks and the rest. But with this high concentration, they just don't have to be older people. It can be very young people, kids who are doing it, because it's attractive, tastes good, supposed to be better than smoking. The reality of it is it's no better.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, vaping is becoming more and more dangerous. If you're talking about the health effects, you're talking about it on a pharmacological level, where you got the health effects, where you got more concentrated amounts of nicotine per capsule, and versus a cigarette. And the main thing that a lot of people used, especially when I was a kid, as far as cigarettes, was
That
the
many
smell.
years ago.
A long time ago. A long time ago. But they talked about cigarettes and how it, after smoking it, it made you smell, or it made your teeth rot, or whatever the case was, that kept kids away from cigarettes for the most part. Vaping doesn't seem to have that stigma attached to it.
Well, it's too new, and clearly it's there. The problem, I think, that people are trying to come up with to educate kids are, because it's very popular because of taste, and it's not really smoking, and it's a vapor.
And
so
the
it's
scary part is you said kids, and we're talking kids as young as 11 years old. When you mentioned
Oh yeah,
it.
very young.
It's very scary.
In fact, pediatricians now are asking kids that are 10, 11 years old, do you vape? Because it's becoming an issue in all of the medical societies to, one, survey for it, talk to people about it, educate them about it, and get them off of it.
Right.
But the other part of it, I think, to be honest, is a scare tactic, but it's real, is that in vaping, some of the same things happen that would happen in cigarettes, but because the concentration is so high, people are restless, they're anxious. There has been several cases of paranoia where people are looking around, they think people are watching them, people are looking at them, people are dealing with it. There's been some depression. Clearly, some people are using marijuana other than nicotine, so they're getting all of the impact of marijuana. Besides that, there was a new study out that identified that a contaminant of the marijuana was vitamin E acetate. Well, vitamin E is something people take. It's in multivitamins and the rest. It has one particular issue when you deal with it by taking it orally. But if you inhale it, once again, it's part of this whole process that's dehydrating the lungs. It's taking the water out of the lungs. Well, you don't want to do that. That's where you begin. Yeah. That dries up the lungs. That creates all the problems. You begin then, in very young people, to begin to see a patient who looks like they have COPD. And
byproducts of that, is that coughing, maybe?
Yes, certainly coughing, as well as things that some people have now with a concentration of diarrhea, vomiting in what goes on. So they're trying to emphasize. They're not singing. Oh, Alex. They're trying to emphasize some of these problems so that kids, for sure, and adults don't think that this is something they can do without risk. There is risk. And because of the concentrations and what we've talked about, this risk is real. It's something that happens. Does it happen to 100% of the people? Clearly not. Right. Does it happen to a lot of people? Yeah. And one of the reasons why we have rates of heart attacks is because smoking is an independent risk factor, as is weight, as is lack of exercise, besides all of the other medical problems. These are independent risk factors. So if you don't die of one thing, you can medicate it, but if you're still smoking, that's an independent risk factor that's going to lead you down the road to a heart attack.
So can some of this smoking, say smoking in a vape pen, because I believe it was smoking in cigarettes that has symptoms of making you want to be lethargic or just relax, calm down, and not really want to move. Do people who vape tend to have that as well.
Well, they have depression. And what we have to realize from a dose response standpoint is when you're dealing with 10 times the dose of the nicotine for every ml that they're vaping. So it's not just 10 times for the whole vape versus one cigarette. It's 10 times for every ml of what they're taking. So that certainly magnifies the fact that you may be lethargic, but what this does is take you from lethargy to depression. So we're talking about severe additional medical problems that people wouldn't have. In my world, it's drug-induced disease.
Right.
But you try and avoid, I mean, this is about prevention, because when you have drug-induced disease, your job is to try and figure out how to now get the person out of that situation if you can, or to treat them in order to handle it. In this particular case, because people are young, people are older, they don't know what the risks are, you're trying to avoid it because you don't have a lot of good options when you have people who have heart attacks, who have cancer, who have epilepsy. Yes, you can treat the consequences of a heart attack. You can treat cancer. You can treat epilepsy. But depending on the progression of it, your outcome may not be very good.
Yeah, I mean it just goes to show it's more than just respiratory problems.
Yes.
There's mental health in here as well.
Yes.
It's very tough. And what are some other things? You mentioned epilepsy.
Yes.
You know, so it could cause seizures.
It can cause seizures. It
Right.
can. Certainly, there's reports now of heart attacks. There's been, as I indicated, 2 deaths this year already.
And especially
and maybe more.
If you're starting at 11, you can look at health problems at, 15, 16 years old?
Yes, you can. And something Em asked me about yesterday is, in people who smoke, in a general respect, you don't expect that they're going to have all the consequences in a year.
Right.
They're going to have cumulative effects by smoking for a long period of time, 10, 15 years or longer. When you have concentrations that we're talking about in vaping,
right.
10 times that for every ml, then the amount of time that it takes to vape versus smoke, you're going to see the consequences much faster than you do by waiting for 15 years or longer to see what the consequences are.
Wow.
So in that regard, that's the fear right now. Is there an epidemic of it? I don't know that there's an epidemic. Is there a major alert? Yes.
Right.
Is there a major concern? Yes. And are people trying to make sure that we're not spending our time over the next several years treating the consequences, if people live, of the vaping, but rather to understand what it is so we can figure out how to do it. Bottom line is education, education, education.
Right, and the problem before with regular cigarettes, people caught on way too late. So I think with vaping, they're trying to catch on before it gets too serious.
They are.
Right. So what are some interventions? What are some ways to curb this alert? Because we don't want to call it an epidemic yet, because we don't think it's at that level.
Well,
but,
I mean, it depends on what people call it, but bottom line here is the following. First, you have to identify it. So part of this is screening, asking kids, and certainly pediatricians are asking kids at younger ages now, do you vape? There's certainly issues with regard to adults with people vaping. That's number one. Number two, aside from identifying them, is education. You're trying to educate them. What is it? What are the consequences? What do you have to worry about it? Because there is a personal choice here. People may have made a personal choice to do this. The question is, do you really have an educated choice, or is this just because it tastes good and it's a vapor, so it's like water, and effectively, in some cases, it's not terribly expensive.
That's what I hear a lot. It's like, it's just water.
Yeah.
Like, well, it's a little bit more than that.
And Em was talking to us before we started talking about people who the little chamber, the vapor. So it's not a big vaporizer like you put on a table and it vaporizes a room. This is a little thing that does it very quickly. Can get very hot very fast. Can burn people.
Mm-hmm.
So there's multiple issues here, but bottom line here is education, education, education. And if people are addicted, then clearly there are methods to try and do that. There are nicotine gums. There are other dosage forms of nicotine to try and lower the concentration, lower the dose over
or like
time.
taper off, right?
Taper it off and take it off. Clearly, some people are very strong and they can stop just cold turkey and just end it. That's probably the best thing that can happen. But for people who don't have that particular strong will, don't particularly feel that they can handle it, there are a host of things to do. And in this case, what we've learned and what we're doing for people to stop smoking is not different than what we would do if people are addicted to vaping. Bottom line in cigarette is education. Bottom line in vaping is education. It's not without risk.
Bottom line is prevention.
It's prevention. It's not about stopping smoking and you can vape and therefore you don't have any of the consequences. The reality of it is you do have consequences. They happen faster. The nicotine is at a higher concentration, and effectively you're risking your life. If you have a death wish, then this is one way to address it.
Well, that's a serious downer.
It is a serious downer.
But one of the things I want to talk about, we brought up education. We also brought up how young they start. Should they start teaching it in schools? Talk about vaping. I don't know if they have enough information yet.
There's not a huge amount of science, but there's
right.
definitely a lot of information out there. And
because I know they are teaching about the effects of cigarettes.
Well, if they are, then they need to talk about vaping.
Right.
The real issue here is that they've got to start very early in the kids' education, make them understand it's a bad thing. Just because it tastes good is not something to go rushing to. It's not an alternative to smoking. And yes, they need to educate as quickly and as early as they can.
It's crazy to think about 7th grade, 11-year-olds can look at vaping.
Yes.
That's very scary. Well, anyways, on that note, any last things you'd like to mention?
No, education. People need to talk to their kids. Educators need to let them know. Doctors need to screen. Bottom line is, vaping is not a better alternative than smoking. It has its own risks. This is really serious stuff. You're gambling with your life.
Yes, and education is part of the reason why we're doing this here.
Yes.
Like, all this you just mentioned about vaping, I had no idea about. I was literally taking people at their word, talking about how it's just water, it's just vapor, and it's flavorful, so it's fun. But really, it really does take its toll, especially on your lungs.
Yes.
Probably the most important part of your body, other than your heart.
Yes.
Or brain. Brain is pretty important.
Well, we want to protect your brain, Alex.
Well, some things are just too far gone. But anyways, that's it for today's episode. If you had any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. We're on all those social media sites, Facebook, Instagram. You can find us there. Also, visit propharmaconsultants.com. We have a free information page called RxInfoX. It has cool little graphs and a ticker full of drug prices that are updated weekly, and information from various healthcare sources that, with articles may include vaping and other healthcare topics. Anything else you'd like to mention?
No, I think that's the main thing. Thanks so much for listening.
Yes, and also Dr. Stern writes articles on, you can find that at our Pharmacy Benefit News. If you'd like to get in touch with our mailer or be part of our mailing system, we do have that for emails. We can send you articles. Is it weekly, bi-weekly?
Our Pharmacy Benefit News is bi-weekly.
Bi-weekly.
And they can certainly send it to the ProPharma page, and we'll add them to the mailing list.
Yes, and we will. That's it for today, and we'll be back next week.